Welcome to Workplace Psychology with Dr. Martha Greidick. I'm Dr. Martha Greidick. This podcast examines a wide variety of work-related issues through the lens of industrial and organizational psychology. And while many of the topics discussed here may be seen as intended for white-collar employees and their employers, in reality, the ideas presented here are applicable across organizations and industries. Additionally, many of the topics discussed here may be applicable outside of the workplace. I encourage you to examine what's presented here, apply what makes sense to you, and simply discard the rest. Many of you have heard the term quiet quitting. It's not a new concept. It's something that has gotten our attention for several years now. What's important about quiet quitting is, well, one, that it's still going on. But the other part of quiet quitting is that oftentimes we overlook, or maybe we don't discuss enough, the consequences of quiet quitting for the employer, for the organization. While quiet quitting has gotten plenty of attention in terms of what's happening for the individual who engages in this kind of behavior or who finds themselves in this kind of state, there are important things to consider from the perspective of the organization, of the employer, and that's what this episode will focus on. Let's start by defining quiet quitting. What is quiet quitting? The bottom line, the most basic definition of quiet quitting is the minimal amount of efforts that are put forth by an individual employee. So basically, the employee does as little work as possible, as little work as they need to, as little work as they can get away with. That's basically being in a state of quiet quitting. It's not offering to do anything extra. It's not going above and beyond. It's not looking out for others or looking for forward movement or advancement. It's simply doing the absolute minimum that is necessary. And after our somewhat recent pandemic, quiet quitting has become the next thing for us to pay attention to. It's epidemic almost in its magnitude. And as I already mentioned, while we focus on what's going on with the individual employee, what has led to quiet quitting, how it affects the individual, we have to remember that there is an impact on the organization as well. So today I invite leaders and managers to pay attention to this episode and this topic in general, because it does affect the organization in potentially tremendous ways. Some of the most common things that can lead to quiet quitting is stress, burnout, being overwhelmed by work, things such as unclear expectations and lack of resources or support at work. All of those can come together to cause an individual to essentially quit their job without actually leaving their job. And that in itself is quiet quitting. As far as the organization goes, one of the most common consequences for the organization when we look at quiet quitting is reduced performance, reduced productivity. That in itself can lead to other things, such as an organization's inability to produce, perform in general, to keep up with its competition. All of those things can lead to decreased profits. An increase in turnover may be associated with quiet quitting as well, because eventually employees who engage in quiet quitting may leave the company on their own, or they may be asked to leave the company. This may leave other employees, those who are left at the company, with an increase in terms of responsibilities and workload. That, in turn, may lead to increased stress for employees and burnout. Now we're looking at a hit to creativity and innovation. So you can see how quiet quitting starts to snowball very quickly in terms of how it affects everybody, not just the employees, but the organization as well. Morale may suffer. Relationships between employees and management can suffer. The organization may not be able to meet its goals. And as things continue to get worse for the organization, it may find itself getting a bad reputation and having a hard time attracting new talent. And of course, let's not forget about culture. Quiet quitting is one of those things that can certainly affect a company's culture. And that's not for the better, by the way. And while an organization can be reactive in its efforts, and certainly there's a time and a place, but being proactive, looking at preventative measures, is very important when it comes to this issue of quiet quitting. One of the biggest things that an organization can do is promote a culture of openness, one that encourages, that allows and supports employees in speaking up and speaking out, in voicing their concerns. When concerns go unspoken and unaddressed, that's when things can lead to quiet quitting. So an organization will do well by promoting the kind of culture that is open and focuses on productive communications. It's important that the organization promotes work-life balance for its employees, especially in today's day and age. We live at a time where technology allows us, many of us, to work from almost anywhere. As long as we have an internet connection or an access to a phone, many people can conduct business, can do their work. And this means working not only from anywhere, but also working at any time, which can often lead to a lack of balance and a lack of disconnection or a clear boundary between work and personal life. So promoting a workforce that has a proper work-life balance is critical for organizations, especially when we look at things such as quiet quitting. Make sure that as a company you offer growth opportunities and professional development for your employees. These things are important. Personal development as well. Many organizations can truly embrace personal development and work that into their own agenda so that both employee and employer get to benefit from development of all kinds. Feeling stagnated is one of those things that can quickly lead to a sense of boredom and being stuck, and that's not that far from the idea of quiet quitting. It's truly just a few degrees before we cross that line. As an organization, it's important that you recognize the hard work and the achievements of your employees. Nothing is more discouraging than never hearing about what a good job you're doing and never being told or never knowing how much your efforts are appreciated. And of course, culture, organizational culture, can make or break the workplace experience for anybody. So it is the organization's responsibility, potentially one of the biggest responsibilities, to create the kind of culture that fosters the type of environment and the type of experience that can be preventative in terms of quiet quitting. When we look at quiet quitting from a leader's perspective or the organization's perspective, it's absolutely critical to remember how important prevention is. And yes, responding to issues as they arise is equally as important for resolving issues. We cannot wait for problems to present themselves before we address them. So preventative measures are absolutely key, and that includes to issues such as quiet quitting. Leaders must pay attention to what's going on within the organization and to what's going on within the organization's workforce. Don't be quick to dismiss things or ignore them because they could potentially turn into bigger problems down the road. Enlist the help of third-party professional help. IO psychologists or industrial and organizational psychologists are a great option. This is what industrial and organizational psychologists do for a living. They work with organizations to resolve all kinds of issues. As this episode comes to an end, let's review what was discussed. Quiet quitting is not a new phenomenon, but it's one that sometimes forgets to look at quiet quitting from the perspective of leadership or the perspective of the organization. And that's what today's episode focused on. Quiet quitting is rooted in many things, including things such as stress, burnout, too much work, not enough focus within an organization. And it can lead to many effects, not only on the individual employee, but also on the organization itself. Things such as reduced productivity or lack of motivation or lack of performance in terms of the organization as a whole are only some of the effects related to quiet quitting. The bottom line is that organizations absolutely must be proactive in their approach to quiet quitting, and while responding to quiet quitting is just as important, we mustn't wait for a problem to arise before we do something about it. This is where being proactive comes into the picture. Having the right culture, having the environment where openness and communications are embraced and promoted is key. Work-life balance is critical, as are things such as focusing on growth and development opportunities, recognizing efforts and achievement. All of those can be key in terms of creating preventative environments when we look at quiet quitting. And of course, that's the big takeaway from this episode, that any organization who wants to be prepared or as prepared as possible for dealing with the potential of quiet quitting absolutely has to be proactive. It's up to the organization's leadership to take charge and do what needs to be done to prevent quiet quitting as much as possible, and then to respond to quiet quitting when it actually happens, if it happens. As this week unfolds, I encourage all of you to consider quiet quitting within your organization. Whether or not you are in a leadership position, all of us can assess what quiet quitting may look like within our own environments, and maybe for some of you, within your own experience, and what can be done to improve on the situation and what can be done to prevent quiet quitting in the future. For those of you who experience this podcast in an audio-only version, I encourage you to check out Stress Free with Dr. G on YouTube, where you can find the video version of the podcast. And while you're there, check out some of the other videos. They focus on effective stress management. So go to YouTube and take a look at Stress Free with Dr. G. The link for that is in the description below. Thank you for joining me today. Please subscribe to this podcast. I look forward to seeing you here again next time. Until then, I wish you joy and well-being.